Good afternoon once more, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another of my rumination sessions with you. I hope that you are having a fantastic weekend and that you are ready to be engaged in another intellectual conversation. Now, is it cliche to say that we are living in some interesting times, to say the least? And these are not times that we should be taking lightly, but there are times that we have to ensure that we understand all the forces that are involved in enslaving us, in the enslavement of the human race. Now, remember that we have just one race of people. We tend to think that we are, made in different races. The politicians have come up with, the white race and the black race and the Asian race. And certainly we have different cultures and we have different language backgrounds and so forth. But, you must understand that race is a political construct. It is not scientific in orientation. It is not biblical in its orientation. The Bible says, I think in Acts 17, verse 27, that is from one nation, one blood, sorry, not one nation now, I'm sorry. It's one blood that God made all nations to dwell on the earth. It was God who separated the nations because of idolatry, because of our rebellion against him. And he did not want the idolatrous people to mix and mingle with his people as they would contaminate these people. Remember now that after Cain killed his brother, God separated those people, right? Because Cain was rebelling. He was rebelling against God, while Abel was true to God. So God had to separate the sons of God from the sons of men. The sons of God were the people who were faithful to God, who were loyal to God, who kept his commandments and did what he mandated them to do. The sons of men were the ones who were described as people who were rebelling against God and who wanted to walk in their way and not in the path that God had clearly marked out for them. Now, let me open up this conversation because I don't want the video to be long. And so let me begin therein. Now, we are going to start today's session with the with Revelation 13. Did I have it here? Yeah, Revelation 13. Now, the books of Daniel and Revelation are prophetic books that God gave to his prophets, his faithful prophets, to enlighten us, to enlighten our minds with regard to the last days before his second return. Now, they also give a lot of history, including, if you read the books of Daniel, the first advent of Christ, but it also speaks about the second advent of Christ. The entire Bible is centered around the great controversy theme, the war or the battle between Christ and his angels and the devil and his angels. Now, remember now that Lucifer, which is now called the dragon, which the Bible refers to now, he's the dragon of Revelation 12, verse 17, because the Bible says that there was war in heaven, right? And we have Lucifer and his angels fought against Christ and his angels, and there was no space for him left in heaven. Now, we must understand that Lucifer was the highest created being in the universe. God made him so. And God endowed him with huge intellectual, physical, emotional, whatever capacities, right? He made Lucifer. Lucifer has a kingly appearance, right? He is extremely powerful. But God is all powerful. So God did not endow him. He could not have been endowed with that status, because if you're all powerful, then that means you're a God. And this is the problem that Lucifer had in heaven. He thought because he was the creature, the created being, endowed with so much power, so much authority, so much light, because his name is Lucifer, Lucifer, right? Luz, which is the Spanish word for light, right? So he was a light bearer because he stood in the immediate presence of the Almighty. Now, I want you to understand that not all angels who reside in heaven have that privilege of standing, walking up and down in the stones, the flames, because God is a consuming fire and he is all powerful. So, not ever all the created beings in heaven, they're invited, I'm sure, sometimes, but they're not, always in the immediate presence of God, walking up and down on the coals of fire. Lucifer, on the other hand, was, because he was the one who guarded the throne of God, right? And he shielded that immortal light that reflected from God, from the other beings of the world. In other words, Lucifer, because he was in the immediate presence of God, he was radiant, he was always shining, and the angels always saw him as a superior being, which God made him so. However, Lucifer thought, because God had given him so much intellectual capacity, so much wisdom, because the Bible says that he was what? Perfect in wisdom, right? He was perfect. If God used the word perfect, it means therefore that there's nothing else that God could add to his perfection at that time, right? But Lucifer corrupted his perfection, his wisdom, by wanting to overthrow the government of God, right? He thought that he should also be God, right? Because he was given so much intellectual capacity, the created beings, the angelic hosts, and saw him as a superior in wisdom, which he was. So he thought, why shouldn't I also be like God? But no, God had not given him that position, right? God had not given him that privilege because he was a created being and will always be until he dies a created being. Now, because God could not and would never give a created being equal status with the Godhead, Lucifer had to be thrown out of heaven because Lucifer clearly, he wanted, it was like, you don't give it to me or I'm going to war against you. Right? So Lucifer was prepared to war physically with the God of heaven because he had become so proud, so haughty that he thought that he was indeed God himself. Now, we know based on scripture that God stood up to him and he evicted him from heaven, and he was sent here. Unfortunately, Adam and Eve, after they had been created, Lucifer, who wanted them to join in the rebellion, humans, he wanted humans, God created in the image of God, to join in his rebellion against God, along with the 1/3 of the angelic host that he had successfully taken outside of heaven. The fact of the matter is that, we fell for it. Lucifer, because he is much wiser, much smarter, much more wily in his deceptions. He is the master deceiver. There's one thing that Satan can do that God can't do. God cannot deceive. He cannot lie. Whatever God says is the truth and should be taken as such, even when we cannot prove it. But he has given us enough evidence. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. God has given us enough evidence, just like he gave Lucifer, that he was a creator God. But Lucifer wanted to delve into the purposes of God. God could not allow that to happen. There was war in heaven, and Lucifer and his angels were kicked out. And the great controversy theme came here. Now, if Adam and Eve had not listened to him, if they had not heeded to his request, then sin would not have entered our world. And there was no way that we would be in the struggles that we are in right now. Now, we can't get into the entire history of the Great Controversy because it's a long history. And one of the beauties of the Bible, I must say, is God is so brilliant. He's a brilliant linguist. He's a brilliant, writer, thinker, intellectual, because he is the intellectual of all intellectuals, right? Because he is the one who created the mind. He is a genius, right, of our brains. He created the brain. In fact, if you ask neurologists, we are not even using the full capacity of the brain. We're not using even 1/3. And even when we're using the full capacity, as when God made Adam and Eve in their original status before they sinned, they could not, they were even far from God's genius, from his mental capacity. So imagine us now not using 1/3 of our mental capacity or of our intellectual capacity, how much duller. So when you think of the most brilliant, the most erudite physicist cannot even compare with the weakest, with the lowest angel in heaven. Remember now that Lucifer, or, at that time when he was in heaven, was the highest angel in heaven. You have different ranks of angels, right? You have the cherubs and you have the seraphims, right? And you have different other ranks of angels, which we will get into another session. But let's get into Revelation 13, because that is the essence of what we're going to talk about in today's session. Now, we have here two beasts that have surfaced in world history, right? We have the sea beast, and for those of you who have studied Protestant history, know that the Protestants all knew, particularly during the Protestant Reformation, that the sea beast referred to the Catholic papacy, the Roman Catholic papacy. That power, which had come out of pagan Rome, right, was a very gigantic empire. The Roman Catholic papacy controlled everything. And if you read history very well, you'll understand that when Spain came to what is known as the New World, and the other Western European powers had heard that Spain was, in the New World, and had found lots of, very precious metals and, important resources, and, was improving in her international status. That's Spain. That other nations, other Western European nations, were very envious, and they likewise wanted to follow in the footsteps of the then Spanish Empire. It's no longer, because it has died. And this is what we have to understand, that empires come up and they go down. So Spain was the first, well, after the Roman Empire divided, because Spain and France and Germany and all those Western European nations are but divisions of the then known Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire, which we will go into studies about the Roman Empire in other sessions, was divided, was broken up into different nation states, because they too, God had to put a check on them, because they were moving too further than he wanted them to go. Even though God sets them up, right? He gives them power, just like he gave power to Lucifer. But when you overstep the boundaries, God put a check on all the nations and let them know that they are just men, that they're just dust, and they must not provoke the Lord Almighty God of heaven. So the sea beast, as we say, was the Roman Catholic papacy. But after the Roman Catholic papacy, was given a wound, it did not fall, but it was wounded. And if you study history, you learn about the French Revolution. And, it's very interesting that the French Revolution started in 1789. And that was the same year that the Bill of Rights was being written. And I think it was ratified in 1791. Right? So that was interesting. So we see where France had a terrible revolution. And, if I were you, I would buy a book on the French Revolution, it's very important that we read about the French Revolution. That is one of the most important revolutions that occurred in the Western world, right? And I think we should know the events that underscored, that led up to that revolution. Now, after that revolution that ended in 1798 and thereabout, we saw where the Italian, was it the French general, sorry, the French general Berthier went and he took the Pope of Rome captive, right? And that brought, a temporary end to the Roman Catholic papacy, because the papacy controlled the kings and the queens, the presidents and of Western Europe, right? There's nothing that they could do without the approval of the Roman Catholic papacy. And that was one of the things that led to the French Revolution. The politicians were tired of this constant battering and this constant harassment by this Pope of Rome, who considered himself to be God ordained, and that all his dictates and his mandates should be followed by kings alike as well as subjects. Now, so after that, you'd say that after the wounding of the beast, that's the Roman Catholic papacy in 1798 thereabout, we can see that a new world order was in vogue, was developing. And this is where now the Enlightenment, the spirit of the Enlightenment started, where people were now questioning the whole matter of religion. Because remember now that when the Roman Catholic Church controlled the entire world, the people were not free to do and to explore different intellectual curiosities, and they were not free to go and explore the world as they would have liked to, or as we are doing to some degree in our present world. Now, the United States of America, started coming up, and immediately, as the Bible said, if you read Revelation 13 well, the two beasts here that are outlined, the sea beast refers to the Roman Catholic papacy. It was wounded because due to the French Revolution. And we see where we talked about the U.S. Constitution being written in leading up to the latter part of the 18th century, and also the Bill of Rights, which underscored and spoke about the rights of men, right? That governments, we were to be governed by the consent of the people, and not by the diktats of kings and queens, as was the case in the old world, right, in Europe. Now, let's go on to Revelation 13, as we're saying, verse 12. Let's begin at 11. Okay, so this is Revelation 13, and this is verse 11. And I beheld another beast. So this is beast coming up after the sea beast, which we already have declared. I will give you a lecture on Revelation 13 in the future, but let's look carefully here. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Right? So here he had two horns, right? And the two horns here are depicting the civil and religious liberty that this king or this nation state is endorsing. And we all know that the United States believed in the separation of the two powers, right? That the civil and religion, the religious and the civil power should not be merged, should not be blended. That was the underlying essence of the Constitution and the coming up of this land beast. Now, remember now that this is coming out of the earth, it's not coming out of the sea, right? So it shows you that here, this beast is not coming, because in the Bible, the sea refers to, a densely populated territory, right? That is with many peoples of different, languages and, and tribes and nations and et cetera, et cetera. But, yes, when the pilgrims came upon the United States, it was, populated people, but it wasn't as densely populated as you had in Europe and in other nation states, perhaps in Asia and in Africa. So this was what the Bible, referred to as the earth beast. It came up quickly and without much difficulty. Right. Now let us go now on to verse 12. And he exercised all the power of the first beast. So this power, which is now, if you study your Bible history, which we will expound upon in future presentations, we know that this is referring to the United States of America, that this, and he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Now, in history, there has never been, and I want you to listen to this carefully, there has never been a resurgence of an empire. Once the empire has died, it has died. There were rumors coming from Iraq before the death of the Iraqi president. What's his name again? Saddam Hussein, right? During the Iraqi occupation, the U.S. occupation of Iraq, that he had desires, right, to rebuild Babylon. Do you know that, Iraq is where, ancient Babylon was? Yeah, so that is, known history. And he wanted to rebuild the Babylonian power, even though God had told him centuries before, or told us centuries before, that the Babylonian power would not be rebuilt. The Medo-Persians were the ones who succeeded the Babylonian power. Then we had the Greeks, right? And then we had the pagan Rome, and then we had the papal Rome, the Rome of the Roman Catholic papacy that took over from pagan Rome. And that is why we call it the Roman Catholic Church, right? Because it is rooted in pagan, in the religion of pagan Rome, right? So it's not by coincidence that it is called the Roman Catholic Church. And if you look at some of its all of its ceremonies, it goes back to the practices and the rituals and traditions of the Roman pagan church, the heathen nations, if you will. But of course, they have merged aspects of the Christian Bible with their pagan doctrines. Now, this is what the Jews used to do, and God had to remind them. He reminded them constantly that he did not want any mixing, any adulteration of his practices, of God's practices, of biblical true practices with the practices of the heathen world. But the Jews wouldn't listen. They, just like the Roman Catholic papacy, they merged these practices together, God's way of doing things, and the things that God wanted them to do that they didn't like, they threw out, and they would replace them with pagan and heathen practices. So the Jews were guilty of this, as the Roman Catholic Church is also guilty of these practices. We're not here speaking about, or speaking against, I should say, the Roman Catholic papacy. What we're trying to highlight the errors that are in that sort of system. Not the people here, but the system. Just like when we talk about America, we're not, casting aspersions on American citizens. We're looking at the system of governance, and we're trying to critique it and to help you to understand that there are some things about it that we need to be mindful of, and that should be concerning to us, and that we should be critical of. God did not make us to be dumb beasts, right? He wants us to reason and to think and to understand clearly. And there's no book in the history of the world that gives you, that makes you think, that forces you to think like the Bible, right? And because we're not reading it as we ought to, including myself, right? I'm here to say that I am too not reading the Bible as I ought to read it. But when you do delve into it, right, you say, wow. You just have to have that wow factor, because you're seeing that if you humble yourself in the sight of God, that he will crystallize a lot of the things happening in our world. Now, let's go to verse 13. And he doeth great wonders, right? So that he maketh fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. So the power here that the United States has is amazing, right? And we have just come out of a pandemic, and in which we have heard so many different stories about how this pandemic came about. First, we heard it was natural, it came out of nature, and stuff like that. But the United States of America has amassed a lot of, technological powers that it can create different things, including earthquakes and storms and things that we think are not necessarily, that men do not have the capacity to do, right? But here the Bible is saying that this power, this earth, the power, this power that has arisen from the earth, he doeth great wonders, and it's going to increase in intensity as the days go by. We're going to see the U.S. along with other powers combining their forces together. Of course, the force that's behind all these empires is the devil, and the devil, as we said before, has a great amount of intellectual endowment that God gave him, which he has corrupted. And he has used all of this power that he has to do evil things, and not for good purposes. Now, and he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, right? Saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. Now, remember, I just told you that in the history of empires, that there has never been one which died and came back. Never. It died, and that's once and for all. It's history, never come back. Egypt as an empire died, will never come back. Assyria as an empire died, and it will never come back. Babylon was a very respected global power. It died, never come back. Medo-Persia, and by the way, Iran is where the Persian Empire was, in biblical times. Now, it's important that we study the history of the Middle East, because it has a lot of significance and lots of things are happening in our world, and we see that we have a lot of conflicts over there. There's a lot of deception in that part of the hemisphere, and we must open our minds to understanding what's going on in that part of the world. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now, the United States is going to give back its power to the former beast. If you read verse 14, well, that is what the scripture is saying. That eventually, this earth beast, the United States, which came out of the earth, the land beast, the lamb-like beast. And remember now that the lamb in the Bible is a symbol of Christ. Christ is a lamb slain from the foundation of the world. It is symbolic of innocence, right? It is symbolic of Christ himself, who is righteous, right? So the Constitution spoke about the separation of powers, right? And that all of us are created equally, right? And that God is our creator. That God is our creator. I mean, no other nation in the history of the world has ever mentioned the God of heaven as being our creator, right? So even though this country has lots of flaws, that's the United States, God has blessed this nation because of its constitution, right? Now, note that this nation has never lived up to the high standards of the Constitution. But God doesn't, the good thing about the God that we serve, he's so merciful that a lot of times he does not bless us, depending on the mistakes that we make. And we see here that the US is making a lot of blunders and has made a lot of blunders in the past, right? We see that no sooner than the United States came up, we saw a surfacing of slavery. Slavery started after the Constitution was put into place, right? Well, it was there before, but even it wasn't as what should I say now? It wasn't as rooted and grounded in the culture as it was after the Constitution was written and was ratified. So it's very important for us to understand that laws, if not followed, if not carefully obeyed, are just symbols. They are not that we should get rid of them because they are there as a standard. But we ought not to say also that, oh, the founding fathers were slaveholders, so we should not trust the Constitution, right? Because it is a standard. Did they live by the standard? No, they did not live by the standard. Are we living by the standards? No, if truth be told, we are not living by the standard, by God's standard, by his laws. And if God was to expose the recesses of our heart, the filth and the rubbish that people would see what we think and what we do, we would be ashamed. So a lot of times when we criticize our governments, and we have to be very careful that we ourselves might not be practicing the same deeds that we are actually accusing them of doing. Now, verse 16 says, and he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their hand or in their foreheads. Now, we are going to talk about this Revelation 13 in another presentation, but I have to move on, right? But, this is going to lead up to the mark of the beast. And this is the most solemn warning that God has given to the world, because in this case, God is going to pour out his anger, right, without mixture of any mercy. There will be no mercy for the wicked, right? So this, even though we have had some vicious wars, World War I, the Civil War, that's the American Civil War, World War II, the Cold War, and all the wars that we've had, the Spanish Inquisition, right? All of these in the Spanish Civil War, these were terrible, terrible wars, yet, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And the severest of brutality was inflicted upon the populace by their own governments. However, these upheavals, these wars, right, cannot be compared to the disaster that is going to come upon us at the end of times. Now, let me go over to this gentleman here. And his name is Smedley Butler, and he was a U.S. military general, a very powerful one, to a very decorated military general in the United States. Here we have that this short anti-war pamphlet was written by a major general in the Marines, who was an American military hero, but became disillusioned with the profiteering propaganda and injustice of the military, industrial, and intelligence foreign policy establishments, and came to oppose American involvement in foreign wars and designed to benefit financial and industrial interests. All right, so this was a decorated military guy, right? He was, in the Marines, right? Now, his book is entitled "War is a Racket," And I would encourage you to download this from the internet and read it. Read these books. Try to understand. This is coming from a guy who used to aid and abet the military-industrial complex in the US. But, he was honorable enough to let us know that this military-industrial complex is not there to defend the interests of the ordinary masses. Now, I think it's here that I need to, I was at. I wanted to read you these two paragraphs before we go into the lesson. Now, because, we understand now that we are in the age of war, right? And I think I have already posited this in previous videos that I don't know. I don't think even my parents and their parents have ever lived in a time where we have not had wars, right? Since World War I, we had the Civil War in the United States, which I'm sure the Western world, those lived in the Caribbean, those lived in Latin America would have heard of, right? And, because we are neighboring countries to the US. Now, you had the American Civil War, you had World War I that came after that, World War II that came thereafter. So, this would have incorporated our grandparents or parents, and, we, who, I'm from Generation X, if you will, was born in the 70s. So, but those, the baby boomers and those before them would have come up in the time of wars, right? And those who are having children, of my generation, they're also being born into war, because after 9/11, we have just been having endless wars. So we're living in that period of wars. We're not living in a time of peace, as we like to say. Yes, it's peaceful on our shores, but we know that eventually the wars that are, thousands of miles abroad, away from us, will eventually be transported to us. It's almost like a hurricane coming, right? And it's all the way in Brazil or Venezuela, and then it finally takes a path until it reaches Florida, right? So it's on its way. We don't know when, but we have to study the science in terms of when this, cataclysmic event or events will come to our shores. Now, he's saying here, war is a racket. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is international. Okay. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. Right? So while hundreds of thousands of people are dying, hope you're listening clearly. We have the people who are engineering these wars, because if war is a racket, I want to make this point very clearly. If war is a racket, it means therefore that the people who are responsible for these wars have engineered them, right? They're not natural. It's not like they happen, coincidentally, but they have been carefully engineered. And this is what we have to understand. It just not, what is happening in Israel did just not come out of nowhere. The seeds have been planted since decades. For decades, they have been planting these seeds. And eventually, yes, sometimes, things might not go as they have planned. And remember too that God is in control. So some of the things that they plan, God will undo them. And then they will have to find other ways and other means. And some of the things God will never allow them to do. Because, if he should allow them to do what they probably plan to do, many of us would have died a long time ago. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about, right? Only a small, not the large majority. And they don't want the large majority of us to know, because if we did know, then there would be a massive revolution. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes, right? That's what happens. It is profitable to war. Slavery was profitable, right? And that is why a war was waged over it. And, those white Americans on the right who like to say, oh, the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about, fighting for, what do they say that it had to do with rights, right? it had to do with rights and, what the rights of American citizens, right? So much to say, right? But the fact of the matter is that the Civil War was fought over slavery, right? Because the Southerners understood that slavery was profitable. They understood that they were reaping in huge profits from the trafficking of human beings, of human lives. And they did not want that to end, right? And had there not been a Civil War, we don't know if slavery would still be in operation even right now as we speak. Now, you cannot read the history of the events leading up to the Civil War and the Civil War itself, that's the US Civil War, and not think that there was some supernatural power involved in that US Civil War. I mean, if God had not carefully interposed in that war, the US would have long died. It was the most brutal war to date that the US has ever experienced on its shores, right? And I think we should read it. And a book I would suggest that you read is the same W.E.B. Du Bois books, the Black Reconstruction. I think that's the name of the book. You might be able to get it online too, but if you can, buy it. We tend to buy frivolous things, right? Like lots of shoes and clothing, and why don't we decorate our minds and feed our minds upon good things? And I'm not saying that it's not good to dress well. I like people who dress well and who look presentable, right? But when we spend so much money on, and when you think about it, a lot of the people that we're buying from and their corporations, they are tied to the military-industrial complex and tied to corporations that support these wars and killing the lives of many people around the world. Let's not, encourage people or support them in their evil deeds. Now, how many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried the bayonet thrust of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? So Smedley Butler is saying here, these men who are planning wars, who are pushing wars, right, they don't understand the destruction and the threat to human lives. They don't, whether the American soldiers or the lives of innocent people being lost on shores abroad. Now, it takes me now to another book that we are going in our discussion that we want to talk about. And this is the book Full Spectrum Dominance, right? The title of the book, I think I don't want to go here and then I lose the page I'm trying to highlight here. But the title of the book, let me just go up so you can see the title of the book. Full Spectrum Dominance, Totalitarian Democracy in the World Order. So this is totalitarian democracy, right? And this is a fitting term for the type of democracies that we are now living in. And, our governments like to tell us that we're living in these great democracies, right? Where freedom exists. And we ought to be thankful to God for the remaining freedoms, though they are dwindling, that remain, and we should take advantage of these freedoms to explore and to put a check to check the wrongdoings of our governments. Now, this book, I think I had the author there on the page. Was it written by Engdahl? Forgot his name. Yeah, F. William Engdahl. Is it on the screen? Yes, F. William Engdahl. Now, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, right? And but you can go and do your own research on F. William Engdahl or Engdahl, right? Let's go back to now. What I want to highlight here and to posit here is the fact that the Russian-Ukrainian War had its genesis way back, had its roots. The seeds were being planted from way back when, right? And this aggressive behavior of the U.S. military goes right back to, as we suggested in previous videos, to 1898, when the United States actually went to war with the Philippines and with Cuba. No, well, they didn't go to war with Cuba. They went to war with Spain. So it's the Spanish-American War. I'm sorry about that. Remember now that these two countries were under the colonial power of Spain. Spain was then the dying empire in this time of the world. And the Cubans and the Filipinos wanted the Spaniards outside of their territory. They wanted their freedom. And the Americans went there on the pretext that they were there to help them to gain their independence and that they could, be to live a life of freedom as the U.S. citizens were living, right? And but they were there for other purposes. Whenever the United States says that it's going to liberate, you must know that they're going there to control. As we talked about, that's an empire, and empires do control. And we're not here casting any aspersions on the U.S. That's what empires do. And if Africa was an empire, if Nigeria was an empire, if Saudi Arabia was an empire, the same thing. If China becomes well, it was an empire before, but if it does resurface as a world power, or it's a world power, but if it does resurface as a global empire, I should say, then they would do the same. We ought not to think that human beings are going to change and listen to their rhetoric because they say they want a multipolar world, that's what they want, or that's what they desire, because we know that empires do not want a shared power. They want to control and to control it by themselves. Now, let me give you just a little introduction to the author. So we have F. William Engdahl is author of the international best-selling book on oil and geopolitics, A Century of War, Anglo-American Politics and the New World Order. He's a widely discussed analyst of current political and economic developments, whose articles have appeared in numerous newspapers and magazines and well-known international websites. His book, Seeds of Destruction, The Hidden Agenda Behind Genetic Manipulation, deals with agribusiness and the attempt to control the world food supply and thereby populations. He may be reached at, and we have there his website. So you might go there and look. I was just giving you here a brief introduction to his work. Now, let's get into the weeds, right, of our discussion. Now, here we see his first chapter 1 in the book, Full Spectrum Dominance. And by the way, full spectrum dominance means that the United States is the unmatched power in the world. It is the unchallenged power in the world. That's what it means, right? So if we think that, according to the Democrats, that the U.S. is seeking a multipolar world, Trump is the threat. Trump is the threat to this multipolar world. You need to rethink your position. because Trump is no threat to the US empire, right? Trump is a symptom of the US empire, right? And everything, the way he behaves is symptomatic of the US imperial. So we need to rethink our position. All of this that's on TV that you're watching, it's entertainment. And even if Trump goes to prison, as some of you desire, you know, it's just for entertainment purposes. It will not change your life. It will not change the fact that your freedoms are being taken away. It will not change the fact that inflation is out of whack. It will not change the fact that, you know, the US is killing hundreds of thousands of people around the globe. So if you find yourself sitting at your television, reading the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times and the BBCs and the Guardian newspapers of the world, if you think that they are educating you, they're informing you, you need to rethink your position, because they're not. They're there to entertain you, to distract you, and to make you not understand that the imperial agenda is on a global march, and it is there to enslave the population of the world. It does not need, you know, it does not, you know, care if you are Black, as you probably think you are, or white, as you think you are, or you know, or yellow, you think you are, for all the matter of purposes, for all intents and purposes, right? It doesn't care, and it will enslave you. Okay, and the pandemic should have taught us, should have given us a lot of insight into where we are going from here. All right, had nothing to do with any virus, because that illness could have been, you know, controlled. But they did not want it to be controlled because it was their purpose to control. Just like we have wars, the problem in Israel can be controlled if they want to control it. We can have a ceasefire if they decide to adhere, if both sides come together. The Palestinians and the Israelis come together and forge some sort of, you know, peace agreement. It can be done. There are some things in this world that can be solved if we are willing to solve them. But if we want wars to continue, then we don't want to solve them. In fact, we want to escalate the problem so that wars can happen and billions of dollars can be thrust into the war coffers while millions of lives are lost around the world. That is what we need to understand, and stop paying attention to what the New York Times and the Washington Post are saying. Now, this is what George F. Kennan, and he was a U.S. State Department, well, he wasn't, he was, I think, the Secretary of State under was it Harry Truman? Yeah, I think he was. Now, listen to what he has to say here. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, and this was said in 1948, by the way, after World War II, when the United States surfaced, you know, as one of the preeminent powers. Remember that after the World War II, we had two preeminent powers that came about, that surfaced. We had, you know, the Soviet Union Empire and the United States Empire. Now, I'm not sure if the Soviets wanted to be an empire, but they were forced into that sort of corner. You know, that is for another discussion. But let me reread. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. So the US is not here to be altruistic, right? And to be heroes and to save Iraqis from their terrible dictator, and the Palestinians or Jamaicans or whomever. They are there to control and to capture the prime resources of these countries, because the US is on a quest for full spectrum dominance, right? And that is biblical, because the Bible says that this nation that started up, that came out of the earth, this innocent lamb-like beast, but notice it's a beast. It has never changed its nature, but it acted. It's like a lion acting very tame. And as soon as it gets near to you, it begins to approach you. It looks wonderful. It begins to caress you, right? To probably touch you, right? And you look in its eyes. As you look in its eyes, and it sees that perhaps you are a threat, it begins to attack you and to destroy you. So that is what the US is now. It's beginning its days of transitioning, where it will eventually speak as a dragon. And notice that the dragon is a symbol of the devil himself. And the Bible says that, there's no good in the devil. Nothing that is good is in him. And even though he might give you lots of things, material wealth, educational success, and all that you might need, he can take them away from you too. He can kill you in the midst of these, great successes. So be careful of underestimating the dragon and the United States, this colossal global hegemon. Now, I want to read you this from the full Specturm Dominance. Remember, we're in chapter 1. On that day, much of the world was looking elsewhere to Beijing, which is, he's talking about where the United States was now going to Georgia, and they was going to wage a war. And, now on that day, much of the world was looking elsewhere to Beijing as China launched the dramatic beginning of the 2008 Summer Olympics. And many of us knew that of the Olympics in 2008 in China. Many world leaders were in Beijing for the event, including the President of the United States, George W. Bush, and the new Prime Minister of Russia, Vladimir Putin. The surprising news that the Georgian army had invaded the breakaway province of South Ossetia at first drew little attention. Few people in the West had never heard of South Ossetia. I had never heard. In fact, I never knew. I heard that there was some invasion by Georgia, but I did not follow that story so much. I must say, my eyes perhaps were also on the Beijing Olympics. And do you see how these things can distract our minds, that we're not following important issues, important events that will affect us in the future? Because that's what sports and all these entertainment things are there for, to occupy our minds and to make us feel that these things are, they are there to give us joy and happiness, when they're not. They're just there to drug our minds and for us to be caught up in these nonsensical matches and games. The region was remote and believed to be of little political significance. I want you to listen as he speaks here, because, we have to make some connections here. And that's the purpose of this discussion. As it turned out, the small republic of Georgia and its invasion of South Ossetia would mark the onset of the most dangerous phase in world affairs since the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the two Cold War adversaries, the Soviet Union, and the United States, stood eyeball to eyeball and came to a hair's breadth from nuclear war. Now, how did the world not know that this was happening? How were we just told in 2021, when the war between the Ukraine and Russia started, that, wow, this is the beginning of the new Cold War? But what we did not know is that the Cold War had not, in fact, ended. Right? We thought at the dissolution of the Soviet Union that in 1989 that power, that war was ended, was the ending of that war. But it was not so. That the global elites, particularly those in the US military-industrial complex, they did not want it to end because, then their profits, their war profit would end, and they could not tolerate that. So they have to engineer new wars, and they have to create new enemies so that they can sustain this military-industrial complex. Right? And I hope you're understanding. I hope you are not being distracted here, because it's very, very important that you comprehend these issues. Now, some began to fear a 21st century rerun of the Guns of August when an equally remote event, the assassination in August 1914 of the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy by a Serb assassin in Sarajevo, triggered the outbreak of the Great War in Europe. That was World War I. That took place between 1914 to 1919, if you have studied your history. Others spoke of a new Cold War, a reference to the mutual balance of terror that dominated world affairs from roughly 1946 until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1980 to 1990. That 1962 Cuban crisis, as some recalled, was triggered by US reconnaissance photos showing construction of a Soviet missile base in Cuba, some 90 miles from Florida. Such a missile base would give Russia the ability to launch a nuclear strike on the US homeland within minutes, not allowing US nuclear bombers sufficient time to respond. Now, this is the reason why Vladimir Putin, not because I am not a pro-Vladimir Putin guy, by no stretch of the imagination, but let's be fair here, right? The US since 2014, to my understanding, and seems before that, has been planting nuclear weapons and other, military arms in the Ukraine, right? And the president, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he saw that that's what the US was doing. I mean, even before that, because Vladimir Putin, even before that event in 2014, he realized that the US was trying to control that area of the continent, right? Because you're going to learn that from the British Empire, from the days of the British Empire, I should say, that the empires realized that the conquest, I should say, of the that Eurasian continent, Eurasian territory, I should say, that is the success that's going to count for the success of any continuation of these world empires. If they cannot control that region, if they cannot control the Eurasian region, it means therefore it's going to be the death of all territories. The British experienced that, and the United States does not want to make that mistake, the same mistake. So they're trying to control Russia and to control China and to control all that sit on that Eurasian Eurasian region, so that they can be able to successfully control the world. Because he that controls that area of the world, and I think that there's something about this Eurasian region also in the book 1984 by George Orwell. I think there is something about that. I can't remember the specifics in that book, but there is something that refers to the Eurasian territory region. Now, what few in the West, outside the Pentagon and highest US and NATO circles, were told was that the Soviet missile installation in Cuba was not a provocation out of the blue. It was Russia's response, however ineffective and however reckless, to the early US decision to place its Thor and Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey, a NATO member dangerously close to Soviet strategic nuclear sites. Now, The Cold War ostensibly ended with Mikhail Gorbachev's decision in November 1989 not to order Soviet tanks into East Germany to block the growing nonviolent anti-government candlelight protest movement, and to let the Berlin Wall the symbol of the Iron Curtain dividing Eastern from Western Europe, fall down. The USSR was bankrupt economically, militarily, and politically. So when we say that the US really brought an end to the Cold War, it is not true. It's a myth, because long before 1989, the USSR was already bankrupt. And people like the Chalmers Johnson and other writers have brought this to the fore, and that, America gave its citizens this sort of, misinformation. They misinformed their citizens, and for them to believe that the United States and also the Vatican, right? The Vatican was also a part of this so-called freedom, guys who went to the to the Soviet Union, and they negotiated and were able to bring the Soviet Union to a halt. The Cold War was over. The West, above all the United States of America, the symbol of liberty, freedom, democracy, and economic prosperity for much of the world, above all for the peoples of the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, had won. So the US said that we are now we have now won this war. We are the ones who are going to be in charge of the world. We are the unchallenged military power in the world, right? We are the unchallenged global military hegemon in the world. And this is where the US is going to assert its arrogance and begin to create wars in a lot of the world, even though some of these wars might not have been imagined, might not have been waged. With the end of the Cold War, Washington proclaimed its aim was the spread of democracy to those parts of the world that had been rigidly confined within the Soviet socialist system since at least the end of the Second World War, and in many cases since the 1917 Russian Revolution. Democracy, listen to this now, democracy was Washington's most effective weapon to increase its control over the emerging nations of the former communist bloc in Europe. The word democracy, however, as the ancient Greek oligarchic families well knew, was a double-edged sword or weapon. It could be manipulated into an enraged mob and hurled with directed fury against one's political opponents. All right. And do you know that it's interesting how they have divided us into camps, into political camps. So you had when President Biden, for example, went into the Ukraine, when that war started with the Russian-Ukrainian war, the members on the right, that the Republican, they were so upset and that he should not be going to war and he's a war president and all of that stuff, right? Now that there is a war between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the people on the left, or the so-called Democrats, the so-called liberals, the so-called progressive people, are suggesting that this war is valid, and that Israel has to defend itself. Have you listened to Hillary Clinton and the fact that she's encouraging that war? She does not want any ceasefire, right? She thinks that Israel should do all in its power to defend itself. And when they say defend itself, they're not, suggesting that they should go to the negotiation table and, to punish, to castigate, because, if the Hamas people are incorrect and if the information that we have received, if what we have been told is true, then of course the Hamas people should, the international law should should run its full course, right? And if they need to be punished, they should be punished, but not to create wars that will kill the lives of many people. All that was needed was to control the techniques for shaping public opinion and the levers of economic change. In these, Washington was well equipped. It dominated global media through instruments such as CNN and orchestrated economic transformation through its control of institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Washington would spread democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was to be a special kind of democracy, if you will, a totalitarian democracy, welding American economic, political, and cultural hegemony together under the military control of NATO. So this is what America's democracy is all about. It's not there to dispense freedom to the people or the nation states that it's occupying, but it is a totalitarian form of democracy where it uses its economic, political, and cultural hegemony to control these nation states, whether it's Haiti or it's Jamaica or it is Ukraine or it is El Salvador, it is the same thing, right? And that's what we need to understand. Even the very US, when we hear that, Trump is the threat to democracy and we have to save democracy, and the solution to solving democracy in the United States is to alienate Trump and his followers. I find that to be infantile from day one. I could not think that that was something to even think about. Most of the world was jubilant at the offer of American-style democracy. And this is very important, and I'm going to say this, and this is my opinion right now. The world, for the most part, people of the world tend to love slavery. It's something very hard to say, but I think we do like slavery. I think we do like when people control us. I did bring to you the survey that was done by the Gallup polls in 2014, which suggested that, I think it was one in was it 14 Americans, would tolerate or would not find anything wrong with a military dictatorship, right? Because I think we have been so conditioned in these days and because we have been having war since, we were babies, right? Since we were a child. So we have become conditioned to thinking that these things are natural, and that in order to have freedom, we must, have some guys wielding their weapons over our heads, right? And I think we need to stop it. And one of the things we need to understand is that these people they can engineer situations, they can engineer disasters, whether it be economic, natural, political, just about any sort of disaster. And then they will tell you that this is a solution. And oftentimes it's a solution that they've always wanted, but could not have achieved under normal circumstances, right? So you need to understand that and to think about that also. Now let's go on, because I need to move on. The euphoria was short-lived. I think that I want to go down here. Now, the United States is as a military-industrial complex, controls economically, politically, culturally, right? And eventually it's going to wind up being also having that spiritual dominance in the world. Remember that we say that the earth beast is going to give back its sword to the sea beast and cause as many in the world to worship that sea beast. And it has to be the Roman Catholic papacy, because there's no other empire that seeks worship, and decimated and blasphemed the name of God like the Roman Catholic papacy. And if you read the history of the Roman Catholic papacy, you will see that. right? And you will see that they were against the Jews and they were against Christ and his people, right? So we can understand that this beast that was wounded, which is the Roman Catholic papacy, is going to reassert its power, but because it does not have a military, it will have to use the United States of America to wield its influence, to force its dominance upon the people, which will eventually be worship, right? That you need to worship this beast, just like we had during the pandemic. We didn't have worship in the pandemic. What we had was that the scientists were behaving like gods, and they told us what we were supposed to do. And if we did not do it, then we were going to be punished. We would not be able to go into supermarkets. Many people lost their jobs. Families were separated and broken up, right? Because of what took place during the pandemic. It was mental conditioning, and many people did not grasp that, and still perhaps do not see what is going on. IMF shock therapy, that's a structural adjustment policies, which is, the IMF is an arm of the US military-industrial complex. I want you to understand that, right? And also the World Bank. And they have many other institutions that form, economic institutions, that is, financial institutions that are a part of that US military-industrial complex. You must read, you must understand, so that when you see them, you can look beyond what they're doing at the moment. Because our objective, really, ladies and gentlemen, is to be, I would say, 10 steps ahead of them. You have to be 10 steps ahead of these people, because if you're not, if you're just stepping with them and you are, where they're at, and you're just slowly moving, you're not going to understand what these guys are about, right? And don't tell me you see and they say, oh yeah, they, who are these people, and who are these they that you're telling me about? They say, they do, whatever they say, and you think whatever they tell you, whatever you see on your television sets, whatever you see in these mainstream newspapers, you think that is law and order. You think that is the gospel, and that you must follow it because that is what they say, right? But you have to look beyond what they say, and you have to look at the fruits. And if you're looking at their fruits, you've got to delve into, have a historical awareness, a historical consciousness, to be able to understand really where they're going. And if the truth be told, many of us, even those of us who are flaunting our degrees and behaving as if we know, we don't have that historic knowledge. And we also need to hone, to study also the Bible, and to see where the prophetic signals are leading us, because if not, we're not going to be able to fully discern what these guys and their agendas are about. Right? So the IMF, the shock therapy, because that's what it really is, a shock therapy. The structural adjustment policies flung open the doors of the former Soviet bloc to dollar holding Western speculators. So what we're seeing is that immediately after the Soviet Union fell, that the United States went to Russia and to many of these nations that were part of the Soviet Union, and they went in there with their shock economic doctrine, with the IMF and, the whole yard, and what they do, and the fact that they demolish your economy and they control your resources. Among those in the stampede were the American hedge fund billionaire George Soros, the fugitive metals trader Mark Rich, and aggressive banks such as Credit Suisse and Chase. The IMF policies allowed them literally to loot the crown jewels of Russia for pennies. The loot included everything from oil to nickel, and from the aluminum to platinum. Right? So we're seeing here where the Western countries, the whole purpose of liberating the Soviets from the communists is to control them. Right? It's not to free them, as the Soviets thought, and rightly so. Many of these people wanted freedom. But what they did not understand is that there was another agenda, not to free them, but to enslave them under another form of ideology. So they were both enslaved under the communist ideology, and they wanted them to be enslaved under the capitalist, the free market ideology. Not the American constitutional ideology, but the capitalist free market ideology engineered by billionaires and these members of the American global elites. A tiny handful of Russian businessmen, mostly former Communist Party or KGB functionaries, seized invaluable state-owned raw material assets during the corrupt Yeltsin era and became billionaires overnight. They were accurately referred to in the media as Russian oligarchs, men whose wealth would allow them to become the new masters of post-communist Russia, the money masters. So we see here where even the local, right, the local, what you call them now, oligarchs, they came together in collaboration with the US oligarchs, Western oligarchs, and they controlled Russia. The same thing happens in other countries. And I've told you in previous videos that these global elites work together, right? Because there's no racial tint or stain on money. Money is money. Profits are profit. Power is power. Right? And you have to understand these things, you know, and don't think that, oh, you're looking at different countries and that what they should do and what they should not, because these countries are not working on your behalf, right? Or at least the government is not working on your behalf, right? They're not. They're not. Now, let's move on because I think I have to end very soon. Despite the solemn pledges and apparently official statements of Washington and not to extend NATO eastward, George W. Bush and later President Bill Clinton went back on their promises. They enticed the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, one by one, into what was to become a newly enlarged, eastward expanding NATO. Right? So from the 1990s, we saw where the US was already not sticking to its treaties. They were trying to create rift among these former Soviet nations with Russia, because their primary goal was to remove Russia as a global power, right? Now, Russia is not an empire, but it is a global power in light of its, its large oil and gas reserve, right? So that makes it one of the global powers of the world. Now, George Herbert Walker Bush was the scion of a wealthy New England family that had made its fortune over decades, first with the investments in Hitler's right, and continuing through powerful alignments with Rockefeller oil and armaments industry. So do you see how the Bushes have made their fortunes, both in oil and also, right, with investments in Hitler's right? A fact often not spoken about, that the US financial institutions, particularly the ones on Wall Street, were involved in investments efforts of the Nazi Germany. So we like to think that the US went there as a, to free the Germans and to, and the Jews and all that sort of lies that we've heard, that we've been told. But that is not true. Now, remember now that we're not saying now the US citizens, because they were horrified by what they saw and would have wanted the Jews and, and wanted the termination of Hitler's regime. However, the US financial interests and the CIA and all the NSA, that's the national security state, do not see eye to eye with us, right? They have their agendas are totally different from ours. As one observer described, the new American arrogance in Washington in the beginning of the 1990s and George H.W. Bush's administration presidential travels abroad assumed the trappings of imperial expeditions overshadowing in scale and security demands the circumstances of any other statesman. America's anointment as the world's leader was in some respects reminiscent of Napoleon's self-coronation. So the United States was self now described as the lone superpower. The author of these critical comments was no outsider or opponent of American power. He was Zbigniew Brzezinski, former national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter and the senior foreign policy strategist for several presidents and advisor to many, including presidential candidate Barack Obama. Brzezinski was a careful student of the master of Anglo-American geopolitics, Sir Halford Mackinder. He knew well the dangers of imperial arrogance at the peak of empire. Such arrogance had, in his view, caused the collapse of the British Empire apparently at its peak between the end of the 19th century and the outbreak of the First World War. Brzezinski warned that such domineering arrogance on the part of Washington a century later could lead a similar crisis of American hegemony. Sorry, I beg your pardon. America, he warned, could lose its status as sole superpower or as the American empire, the term favored by neoconservative hawks, such as William Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard, and Robert Kagan, senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Zbigniew Brzezinski had been one of the architects of the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, by provoking and then masterminding that war in which the US government had trained Osama bin Laden and other radical Islamists with advanced techniques of irregular warfare and sabotage. Brzezinski had done more than perhaps any other post-war strategist, with the possible exception of Henry Kissinger, to extend American dominance through military force. Brzezinski was no softy. He was an ardent American imperialist, what in Washington was called a realist. He knew that American imperial domination, even when it masqueraded under the name of democracy, needed careful attention to its allies in order to maintain global power and to control what he called the chessboard, Eurasia. But that is the purpose, ladies and gentlemen, to control that region of the world, because he who controls Eurasia controls the world, right? Other powers were to be managed and maneuvered to prevent the emergence of rivals to US dominance. In this context, in his widely debated 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, and I encourage you to read that book also, Brzezinski referred repeatedly to US allies, even including Germany and Japan, as America's vassals. All right, so I have been saying that to you, right? That the US is not desirous of sharing its power, its empire, with any other country, be they England, Germany, France, Italy, right? It wants to be the unrivaled, the unchallenged power in the world. It desires full spectrum dominance, right? And that is what it is going to get. Even though it's going to get it in, and it's going to impose serious harm upon the world, including forcing the world to worship, to worship a God that is heathen in nature. Now, Brzezinski had no quarrel with the apparent end goal of the Bush-Cheney foreign policy, named the global American century, an Americanized version of imperial rule. Rather, Brzezinski differed only in his vision of the means with which to reach that goal. And this is where the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, right? They do not disagree with global American hegemony. What they disagree about or disagree with is the way, the method, right, in which that particular agenda will be achieved. All right. So don't you ever think that when you vote for either of these parties that you're voting for the end of the American period. Symptomatic of the first decade and a half of American supremacy, Brzezinski had noted were the worldwide presence of U.S. military forces and the increased frequency of their engagement in combat or coercive operations. Deployed on every continent and dominating every ocean, the United States had no political or military peer. All right, let me just close here quickly. The events in Georgia of August 2008 could not be understood without going back to the 1990s and the history of the US NATO expansion to the doors of Moscow. The administration of George W. Bush, that's George Bush Sr. rather, had broken its promise to Russia not to expand NATO to the east. Now, in 2008, another Bush administration was putting enormous pressure on reluctant European Union and European governments to admit to former Soviet republics, Georgia and Ukraine, into NATO. So from then, the seeds of this Russian-Ukrainian war had been laid. Right? And we got up 2021 when we saw the war started between the Ukraine and Russia, thinking that that is just a reaction by a madman, by Putin, as the media houses would like to put it. Not would like to put it, that's how they put it. That, you know, this was a madman who wanted to occupy Ukraine, who didn't want them to be free. Right? When this plan has been in the agenda decades. Right. This plan has been on the agenda for decades. Okay. That new NATO expansion came in the wake of a bold announcement in early 2007 by the United States government that it planned to install advanced missile bases and radar stations in two former Warsaw Pact countries, now NATO members, Poland and the Czech Republic. The Bush administration claimed that the decision to place its deceptively named ballistic missile defense infrastructure in Poland and the Czech Republic was allegedly to defend against rogue states like Iran. This assertion produced the strongest response from the Kremlin. In actual military fact, it was not defensive at all, but a major offensive gain for Washington in any future military showdown with Moscow. All right, so the seeds had already been planted, you know, for this Russian-Ukrainian war. Right, and it's for time for us to understand this, right? I think I have to end here. I don't want to continue because it's a lot, and I think that, you know, one of the objectives of these presentations is to sensitize you to information that we might not be hearing in the mainstream media, and to allow you to think. Right? We've got to change our mindsets because we have been long indoctrinated. We have long been conditioned to think in a certain way. And it's for this reason why the imperium can, you know, achieve, well, it achieves whatever it wants to achieve, because it knows that, you know, it has you know, a completely indoctrinated populace. right? And I know that many of you out there will still not believe. You will still say, you know, no, that's not the full story, and that, you know, the US is seeking to do good. And if you think so, then fine, right? But if you're looking carefully, if you're looking keenly at the developments in our world, you will see that there is a path, right, on which the US is walking. Right? We are living in some dangerous times. And this mighty colossus called the US Imperium is getting out of control. And we've got to think in terms of, you know, what we are going to believe. Are we going to continue to listen submissively to what our authorities tell us, or are we going to try to understand, try to grasp the daily occurrences around the world? Are we doing enough to research? And research, you know, means that you're going to read. Read for yourselves. That's what it means. Read. It's not, you don't have to go to write a thesis, right? You just read. Read. Read as much as you can on different issues and on also on different perspectives. It's not time now to be a left-wing ideologist or a right-wing ideologist. It's now time that we get our houses in order. And when I say our houses, I don't mean our physical houses. I'm talking metaphorically. I'm speaking the houses of our minds. We need to redecorate our house, the house of the mind, right? That we can be able to think straight. Because the rubbish of error has inundated our minds that we cannot even think clearly, right? And that is why we can't have serious discussions anymore. Or our discussions are so emotionally charged that we are killing each other left, right, and center. All right. So that's my challenge to you today. I hope that you have enjoyed, all right, another important and thoughtful lecture series, and that I look forward to seeing you in another chat, in another discussion. Thank you so much for joining today, and I'll see you. I see you. Bye.